The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 23rd chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The Gospel of the Lord. So, for many of you who know my silly taste in movies, it will come as no surprise that I am one of those people who is absolutely thrilled that at the age of 100 years old, Mel Brooks is again making sequels to movies that he made decades ago. First, there was History of the World Part 2, and now we are getting ready for Spaceballs 2, the spoof on Star Wars. And for me, one of the things that has always made the Mel Brooks movies funny is that he really spends time understanding the things that he is spoofing and parodying. Anybody can mock something, and sometimes that can be funny too. But if you really want to spoof something and show how ridiculous a certain way of thinking or behaving is, you really need to understand the history and the context of that thing. And when you watch some of these movies, and there are others besides Mel Brooks, you realize that he has put a lot of time and effort into understanding this. And in fact, he always so invests himself in these movies that in spite of the fact that he is the director, he always makes at least one part for himself so that he can be an actor as well. And one of the great lines that I remember that Mel Brooks wrote for himself during History of the World Part 1 was when he plays one of the French King Louis. And he is surrounded by opulence and power and everything else we consider decadent. And periodically, as he's enjoying all of this stuff, he turns to the camera and says, "It's good to be the king." All these things, it's good to be the king. And usually, that's the way it sort of seems to most of us. And probably because we don't know any kings or royalty personally, and usually most of us have not done all the background research that Mel Brooks did, we often imagine that kings are people who just enjoy this unlimited amount of power. They can just do anything they want, and if you can't, hey, why bother to be the king? Kings are people who enjoy unlimited wealth. They never run out of money or ideas on which to spend the money on. And kings are supposed to be people who have unlimited popularity, or at least people have to pretend to like them, or else. So it seems like it's really good to be the king because people will all treat you nicely and things. And yet, if you have studied even a little bit of history, it quickly becomes apparent that for most kings, this was not the way it was, at least not most of the time. In fact, for many kings, even though they did enjoy wealth and power, it's also the case that for many kings, they were often the targets of assassination plots and death threats, and sometimes with good reason. Herod the Great, who we will read about soon during Christmas, was a puppet king who was supported by the Romans. And he did have an awful lot of power that he was vested in as long as he kept, kind of things under control with the Romans. The Romans let him do pretty much whatever he wanted, but he was sort of despised and he was constantly paranoid that people were out to get him. And that is why he killed all these people around him, because he was paranoid about that. And sometimes he was right. There were people out there to get him because he was a nasty person and he collaborated with the Romans. So he was not terribly popular. It's also the case that many kings were absolutely despised, even though they were the king. And Caesar, who is the emperor, he is actually the king over everything. He had a lot of power, but he was not so real popular with most of his subjects, except for a few people in Rome who were getting kind of the good end of the stick over this. And it's often the case, as you read things, that kings, in spite of the fact that they seem to have unlimited checking accounts, run out of money. And sometimes this is why people were plotting against them, because they were bankrupting the place. I remember years and years ago visiting the Neuschwanstein, which is the castle in Germany, southern in Bavaria, that the Disney castle is modeled on. And that castle was actually built in the middle of the 19th century. It was the romanticized version of what people thought a castle should have looked like in the Middle Ages, but it was so new that when it was built, it had electricity in it already. But that was very, very expensive in the 19th century, and Mad King Ludwig, who was the king of Bavaria, was at one point later found dead floating in the Bodensee, and the story is because he had bankrupted Bavaria. And that was why there was a plot against him, because he did, in fact, run the entire country out of money. So in reality, it usually wasn't so good to be the king. That certainly was often the case for the kings of Judah and Israel. Very often the kings, even the good ones, had a hard time. And while some were wealthy and powerful, they still had a tough job, not only because of the people's expectations, but because of God's expectations. Because in the beginning, there are no kings in Israel or Judah. In fact, God advises against it. When the people say in the Old Testament, give us a king, God goes, no, 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 you don't want a king. The prophets say that. But when God does agree to allow kings, it was with the condition that the king would be accountable to God. The king had to be about the business of God's vision for the people and not his own agenda. And the king had to be an example for the people. All the rules that applied to the people applied double to the king. And the king had to be willing to sacrifice himself for the people. This is why over and over, like in today's first reading, the king is lifted up as a shepherd. Shepherds have dangerous tasks. They need to defend the sheep. That was what the king was supposed to do. The king was supposed to share the people's fate and was responsible for defending them from their enemies. But the Old Testament tells us about lots of kings who did not, in fact, do this. Actually, the phrase, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, is perhaps one of the most common descriptions of kings in the Old Testament. But nevertheless, accountability and self-sacrifice were the things God continued to expect of kings. And so it was often manifestly not so good to be the king. And certainly it was not great for Jesus when he was called king. In fact, the title king is rarely applied to Jesus except at his trial and his crucifixion. When today's gospel reading points out that people were mocking him for being the king, and the sign is put over the cross that says, this is the king of the Jews. King, or calling yourself a king, or being thought of as maybe the king, was a reason you got crucified. It was a capital offense in the Roman Empire. Yet even then, Jesus does not reject the title out of hand. A few verses before today's reading, Pilate asked Jesus during the trial, is he a king? And Jesus replies by saying, well, you say so, which is an odd response, but not entirely a rejection of the title. It's just that the title king means something different to Jesus because it means something different to God. And in the end, Jesus isn't the kind of king we usually imagine, but he is the kind of king that God always wanted. Because it's from the throne of the cross that Jesus reigns as a king who actually does God's will. Even in his dying, Jesus is going about the work of saving people like the penitent criminal. Jesus is focused on what God wants instead of what he wants. Jesus reigns from the throne as a king who's an example of God's patience and mercy. He says to God, Father, forgive them, the very people who are killing me, instead of, Father, zap them for this. Send them to hell, make them. He's looking to forgive people. That's God's patience and mercy, even in his own dying. And Jesus reigns from the throne as a king who's finally willing to sacrifice himself for his people. Because it's the idea that Jesus bears the guilt of our sin and selfishness and anger, rather than making us pay him, which is the normal way that kings operate when the cost is high. Jesus doesn't reject the title of king because in Jesus, God himself becomes the king who does what he'd always asked his kings to do for centuries. But that also means that for us, we need to consider what it means to live as citizens of this kind of king. To proclaim Christ as king isn't just about saying, isn't it great that Jesus loves us like a good king? It's also about hearing our call to be people who are committed, like Jesus our king, to doing God's will, even and especially if it doesn't make us rich or popular, and asks us to also do things to care for others, even who don't like us, and even people who don't say thank you. I mean, right now, we're about to do this great big thing where we take food to several families for the adopted families, and that's always a great experience because those families always say thank you. They are very, very grateful for what we're doing. But part of living as Jesus' subjects in his kingdom is being willing to do that kind of stuff for people who don't know it was us who were giving them things and who don't care and don't say thank you. Part of being people who live into Jesus' kingdom means sharing God's love and mercy. And like Jesus, to seek good for those who don't like us and those who may not like us. Because part of God's love is it's not really about having a warm, fuzzy feeling for other people, but about seeking good for them. Jesus is seeking forgiveness for the people who crucified him. He's not endorsing their behavior or asking God to let them do that some more, but he's seeking what they need, which is forgiveness. And part of living as citizens of God's kingdom, of Jesus' kingdom, is by living in a way that we show God's love. Real love, showing that real love is really not just a mushy feeling, but about sacrificing my own agenda and my own comfort for the sake of somebody else. And that's sometimes the hardest part of all. It's not just about writing a check, but about being willing to say, all right, I'm going to take time that I was going to spend on myself and worry about somebody else. Those are really not the things that happen so often in our world today. But as followers of Jesus, our King, when we're willing to live into the kingdom right now, by doing as Jesus did, we open ourselves up to being God's instrument of good in a world that desperately needs some good news right now. When we're willing to live into the kingdom by doing as Jesus did, we give the world a foretaste of a God who cares even for people who don't care about God. And when we're willing to live into the kingdom by doing as Jesus did, we show that God's love is not finally a concept or a feeling, but a real and tangible reality in the lives of